Imagine opening an ancient Egyptian tomb and finding not one mummy, not two, but an entire chamber filled with the dead. And among them, something even stranger, a mummified dog. In the Theban Necropolis on the western side of the Nile near modern Luxor, archaeologists have been studying one particular chamber inside Tomb 209, known as TT209. What they found was not simply a collection of ancient bodies, it was a burial space that had been reused for generations, gradually changing as more people were placed inside. And the deeper researchers looked, the more complicated the story became. Inside the chamber, researchers identified 16 mummified human individuals and a mummified dog, along with disturbed remains representing at least 4 additional people. At first, the discovery sounds like a simple mystery. Why would so many dead people end up in the same chamber? But that question misses the most interesting part. The real story is about how the burial space changed over hundreds of years, and what those changes can tell us about the people who kept returning to the same tomb. The tomb itself dates back to Egypt's 25th dynasty, when Nubian rulers controlled Egypt. Its original burial practices were very different from what the chamber eventually became. Earlier burials appear to have been organized around individual people, with coffins, funerary objects, amulets, and defined areas for the dead. Each person had their own place within the chamber, and the coffin helped to separate one burial from another. This was not originally designed as a room where dozens of bodies would simply accumulate together, but the tomb did not remain frozen in that original state. Over generations, other people were brought into the same burial space. Every new burial had to exist alongside everything that had already been placed there. The available space became increasingly shaped by earlier bodies, coffins, objects, sediment, and the physical walls of the chamber. Instead of starting with an empty room every time someone died, later mourners were working with a space that already had a history. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. As the chamber became more crowded, later burials were increasingly placed beside, against, and above earlier remains. To modern eyes, that arrangement can look chaotic, but researchers argue that it was not simply random. The position of an earlier body could influence where the next body could go. Objects left behind could affect the available space. Even the shape of the chamber itself became part of the burial process. In other words, every new burial was being added to a space that had already been transformed by the people buried there before. Over time, the tomb developed a completely different kind of order. The early burials had been centered around individual people and their separate burial spaces. Later, the chamber increasingly became a dense collective environment where the dead were arranged in relation to one another. The important change wasn't simply that there were more bodies, the entire logic of the burial space had changed, and then, somewhere within this complicated arrangement, researchers found one of the strangest clues of all: a dog that had been deliberately mummified and placed among the human remains. The mummified dog is where the discovery becomes even more difficult to explain. Researchers found the animal positioned directly over the lower limbs of a man and a woman. Its placement makes the dog different from an ordinary animal remain that simply happened to end up inside the tomb. Someone had placed and preserved it within the same funerary environment as the humans. But what that placement actually meant is something archaeology cannot answer with certainty. The dog may have had a meaningful relationship with the people buried beneath it. It could have been an animal connected to them during life, or it may have carried a symbolic role in the funerary practices of the people who placed it there. Researchers have even considered whether the animal could have had a role connected with the journey of the dead into the afterlife. But that is an interpretation, not a proven fact. The tomb gives us the position of the dog, but it does not give us a written explanation saying exactly why it was placed there. And there is another reason the chamber is so difficult to reconstruct. The tomb was located in the Wadi Hadassun, an area affected by flooding. Over time, water could carry sediment into the tomb and disturb parts of the archaeological deposits. Some remains were also found in secondary or disturbed position. That means researchers cannot simply look at every bone and assume it is exactly where it was placed thousands of years ago. Some parts of the original burial arrangement have been altered by everything that happened inside the tomb after the burials took place. Even with those complications, the pattern is still surprisingly clear. The chamber was used repeatedly across a very long period, from the 25th dynasty and later periods into the Ptolemaic era. Different generations returned to the same funerary space, and each generation inherited a chamber that already contained the dead. They did not begin again from an empty room. They had to work around what was already there, and that gradually changed how new burials were arranged. This helps explain why the later bodies appear so densely accumulated. It wasn't necessarily a moment when someone decided to create a mass burial. It was a process that developed slowly, one burial after another. A body was placed into an existing environment, and then another person was buried beside it, and another above or around the earlier remains. Over time, individual burials became part of a much larger collective arrangement, and that may be the most important discovery inside TT TT209. The researchers weren't simply looking at a tomb that had become crowded, they were seeing a record of changing human behavior. The way people treated the dead had evolved as the chamber itself changed. What began as a space organized around individual burials gradually became a space where the dead were physically connected to one another through layers of bodies, objects, and sediment. But there was still one question left. Why did people keep coming back to the same tomb for so many generations? The answer takes us beyond the bodies themselves and into the social meaning of an ancient Egyptian tomb. A tomb like TT209 was more than a place where a body was left behind. For the people who used it, burial was part of a much larger relationship between the living, the dead, and the space they shared. Returning to an existing tomb meant entering a place that already carried the memory of earlier generations. The coffins, objects, bodies, and remains were not simply obstacles in the chamber. They were evidence of people who had already passed through the same funerary world. And as new burials were added, the tomb itself became a physical record of that continuing connection. That is why the researchers' discovery is more interesting than the simple image of 16 mummies and a dog. If the chamber were nothing more than a random collection of bodies, there would be little reason to study how each burial was positioned. But the arrangement shows that later burials were influenced by what came before them. The dead were not being placed into an untouched space. Each new burial became part of an environment that had already been shaped by previous generations. Over hundreds of years, that process transformed the chamber. Individual burial spaces gradually became more crowded. Coffins became less important in organizing the available space, and bodies increasingly became positioned in relation to other bodies already inside. What looks confusing from the outside can therefore preserve a sequence of decisions made by people who lived centuries apart. The chamber became almost like a physical timeline, where every layer represented another moment in the history of the tomb. And the mummified dog adds another layer to that story. We may never know exactly who owned the animal, why it was preserved, or why it was placed over the lower limbs of the man and woman, but its presence reminds us that Egyptian funerary spaces were not always simple arrangements of human bodies. Animals could also become part of the rituals, relationships, and beliefs surrounding death. The dog is therefore not just an unusual object inside the tomb, it is another unanswered piece of a much larger human story. What happened inside TT209 was not one dramatic burial event. It was something much slower. People died, were prepared for burial, and were placed inside a chamber that already contained the remains of others. Then another generation came, and another. Floods moved sediment through the tomb. Bodies were disturbed, objects remained. New burials changed the arrangement again. Century after century, the chamber accumulated evidence of how different people interacted with the same space and with the dead who had come before them. And perhaps that is what makes this tomb so fascinating. We often imagine ancient Egyptian tombs as perfectly planned spaces, frozen exactly as their builders intended them. But TT209 shows something much more human. A tomb could change. Its meaning could evolve. Its original organization could gradually disappear beneath generations of new burials, while still preserving traces of every stage along the way. So when archaeologists look at the 16 mummies and the dog inside this ancient chamber, they aren't simply looking at a room full of dead bodies. They are looking at hundreds of years of human decisions, preserved underground. The strange arrangement is not just the remains of a forgotten burial. It is the story of how one place continued to matter long after the people who first built it were gone. And somewhere inside those layers, there are still questions we cannot answer. Who were all these people? What relationships connected them? Why was the dog placed where it was? And what did each generation believe it was doing when it added another burial to a chamber already filled with the dead? We may never know every answer, but perhaps that's exactly why TT209 still matters. Because after more than 2,000 years, the tomb is still telling us something about the people who refused to let their dead simply disappear.